anyway. Nancy?
Here we go again. We get to hear two writers read. Today it is Marsha Iverson and Nancy Weisner, and I'm so looking forward to that. But you know how we start out with Paul's poem. And here we go. I need the audience to be right with me on this one. I say a line and you say a line. Here we go. Right, right, right.
Right, right, right.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
And bring us great delight.
Oh my goodness. Here we go. Talking about writing just a bit. This session of Writers Read, I have invited the writer to kind of share with us a part of their process. And in giving this some thought, I remembered how many times in the classroom I started out handing out blank paper, and there would be some in the classroom that would say, "Oh, good, I get to write." Then there would be some in the classroom who would stare at that paper. And those were probably the kids that wanted to draw. Those were probably the kids who would rather sing than write. Those were some of the kids that would rather do a somersault. We have so many different ways of communicating. Marsha, good to see you again, and welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Nancy.
Tell us a little secret about your writing process.
Well, true confession, I used to write for a living. But those writings had specific tasks to achieve, and usually fairly short deadlines. So those started with the needs assessment and strategic planning and resource evaluation and measurable goals and objectives. And I always wrote them on the computer. But this is more like transcribing home movies. And we didn't have home movies. So I just waited until the subject visited me in my head, and we sat and chatted.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful beginning. You waited till the subject visited you in your head. That's
Yes.
a great description of it, isn't it?
Well, it helps that these were my family.
Well, we would love to hear you read now, Marsha.
Thank you. You might recall the previous reading where I introduced my nearest uncle, literally. Ervil White and his family lived in the house on the farm that was closest to ours. I wrote of his unexpected kindness and what seems in retrospect to be a twinkle in his eye after he magically, painlessly removed my first loose baby tooth and several thereafter. In a fit of foreshadowing, I mentioned seeing that very twinkle in the eye of Uncle Ervil's wife, and Agnes, nearly 60 years later when I asked her how they met. My reading today is her story. Born in 1902 in Dixon, Texas, to John H. Barber and his wife Dora, Alice Agnes Barber was the first of 3 children. I don't know the details, but by the 1920s, the family had moved to Greenlee County in the wilds of eastern Arizona. The region was known for mining and as a stop on the interstate stagecoach route. By 1924, Agnes had achieved her teaching credential at the Tempe Teachers College and was a young new teacher in the town of San Simon in the very southeast corner of the state. Here's where our story takes up again. When Agnes was in her mid-90s, I asked how she met her future husband, my Uncle Ervil. She grinned and with that twinkle said, "He was given to me. I had to keep him." I did not expect that answer. Agnes and a friend were walking down the boardwalk when they spied a wiry young stranger crossing the street. They knew that the school principal, my oldest uncle, Garland, was expecting a younger brother to come from Tempe to help him build a fence. Given the shortage of visitors to San Simon, today's population is 165, it was easy to assume that the man was that brother. As his trajectory crossed theirs, her friend said, loud enough for him to hear, "Well, he's too short for me. You'll have to take him." That's when I saw Agnes's eyes twinkle and again heard the world's most beautiful laugh. What follows are my best recollections, observations, and recountings of stories I know either first or second hand from Agnes. Early in their married years, Uncle Ervil and Aunt Agnes lived in the family home on the farm in Tempe with their in-laws, my grandparents, on a working dairy farm where they raised silage, cotton, and Holsteins. Everyone worked at something. Agnes was tasked with helping her mother-in-law cook and serve meals to the extended family and any additional farm workers who happened to be around at the time. Instructed to make the gravy, which was a key component of the twice daily menu of biscuits and gravy. Agnes reached for an onion and was told sharply, "We do not put onions in the gravy." Somewhat chastened, but not dissuaded, Agnes made onion-free gravy and bided her time. By and by, Agnes was again the designated gravy maker when her mother-in-law left the kitchen on an errand. Agnes quickly grabbed, chopped, and sautéed the onion and made gravy her own way. This sin passed without comment until after the meal, when her father-in-law, the patriarch, leaned back and gave a rare sigh of contentment, declaring, "This is the best gravy I have ever tasted." Again, the twinkle in her eye appeared, and Agnes gleefully said, "There were onions in the gravy after that." In the 1920s, most Arizona farm women were expected to do the chores, prepare the meals, bear and raise the children, remain quiet, and basically do what they were told. That's what her mother-in-law did. That's what her father-in-law expected. While I didn't realize it as a kid, I know now that Auntie Agnes was a serious rule breaker, independent, well-educated, highly capable at any task, and something of a free thinker. It was rude to talk of politics or religion, so she never did. But she was of legal age when women's suffrage gave her the right to vote. In addition to being a farmer's wife, mother of 3, grandmother of 9, Agnes was a certified teacher, a substitute teacher, and later a business school instructor. She was a nonstop knitter, an active member of the Tempe Women's Club, an avid bridge player, and known for improbably good fortune when it came to winning door prizes. All in all, Agnes was probably the most social member of the family. When I was young, after grandmother Laura died, Agnes was the one person who could reliably be found at home when I, alone, was looking for company. At first, she and Ervil lived in a modest but charming 2-story wooden farmhouse, probably dating back to the early 1900s. It was a soft green, surrounded by long grass and unpruned fruit trees. Near the railroad tracks that ran between the hill and the barns, that house was a little farther away than I could venture on my own, so I was rarely inside and have no memory of the interior. Also on the hill, 2 of Ervil and Agnes's adult children and their families had settled within hollering distance. Their daughter Jeannie and her 2 preschool sons lived in a mobile home in a small gully. Their son Johnny, his wife Yvonne, and their baby lived in a modest 2-story wooden house they built for themselves. Altogether, at peak occupancy, there were 5 family homes on the hill, and one house occupied by the manager of the Salt River Project Irrigation District Powerhouse, which provided irrigation water and a power supply to the entire farm in exchange for the corner of land that Patriarch Elijah, known as Papa, deeded to the newfound water and electric utility. When I was in elementary school, Ervil and Agnes designed and built a modern cinder block rambler just across the draw from our yard, less than a football field away. That site was fair game, and I would visit frequently. Agnes was always ready to offer me a glass of water, companionship, and some sitting time. I spent many an afternoon watching her knit an endless array of sweaters and blankets, mostly for babies and toddlers, not knowing that this would be the pattern of our adult friendship as well. As a kid, I pestered her to teach me how to knit, but she refused. "You're right-handed." "I'm not. It won't work." I argued that I could sit across from her and mirror her movements, but she was adamant that it would be a hopeless venture. She remained firm on that issue, so I eventually taught myself. When she wasn't knitting, Aunt Agnes was cooking, tending the Holstein calf penned in a modest-sized corral between her house and Jeannie's trailer, or gardening. Agnes had been selected by renowned rose breeders Jackson and Perkins as a test gardener for new varietals, and she had a breathtaking field of hybrids arrayed in rows with crop-like precision. Her rose garden commanded a large space in front of their new home, probably 20 by 30 feet. More like a crop than what we think of when we contemplate rose gardens. There were no shade trees, no stone paths, no benches or water features, no softening shrubberies, ground cover, annual or perennial plants of any kind. There the roses stood, thriving on a hard rock hill in the full Arizona sun. Now, I assumed there was a connection between the calf and the rich compost of the rose garden, but I didn't pay much attention at the time. I did note that the calf would change sizes over time, from small to medium to large, and then small again after an absence. When you've seen a few dozen Holsteins, you don't spot them as individuals. Agnes's rose garden was a festival of brilliant colors, from the deepest reds to purest whites, yellows, purples, oranges, silvery blues, and lavender. Several varieties sported stripes, spots, or multicolored petals, from single buds to dinner plate-sized clusters on each stem. Together they made a welcome and unexpected visual indulgence on this otherwise purely functional family farm, belying the strenuous effort Agnes made to keep them looking their best. In her kitchen, Agnes reigned, ready to prepare and serve at a moment's notice. Impeccable, filled with light, as neat as a home economics lab, her modern kitchen was always welcoming. On this extended family farm, the nuclear families had proximate relationships, loosely adjacent but independent, within reach when we needed each other, but otherwise autonomous. 5 family homes with 5 respectfully different sets of lives. There were no family potlucks or picnics, no big holiday meals once Grandma Lura died. So welcoming as Agnes' kitchen was, we didn't spend a lot of time there, and didn't, as a practice, share food. It wasn't inhospitable, it just wasn't done. Which made my 2 earliest experiences in Agnes's beautiful new kitchen memorable from rarity as well as instructional value. To inaugurate her new home, Agnes invited me and my mother to lunch, to be social and to help me acquire proper etiquette. She set a lovely table, and served appealing sandwiches, cottage cheese with fancy sliced tomatoes and onions, and a cold iced tea. In contrast, meals at our house were far less decorative in cuisine or presentation. During our polite mealtime conversation, my mother commented on the sandwiches, inquiring about the meat, which for all the world looked like shaved ham. Pink, thinly sliced, almost festive amid lettuce and condiments. Tongue, Agnes replied. I recalled slyly, all too familiar with the working of cows' tongues, as they ate cottonseed cakes covered with molasses in the dairy barn. But I gave it no more thought until my next opportunity for a meal with Agnes. We'd been sitting one afternoon when the kitchen timer began to buzz. Agnes put down her knitting, looked at her watch, stood, and as she headed toward the kitchen, said, I suppose you'll be staying for dinner? As I followed her to the kitchen, she reached the oven and removed a roasting pan with a large cone-shaped hunk of meat that didn't look like the kind of roast I had seen before. Always cautious, I asked tentatively, what are you having? Beef heart, she replied. Then the harsh facts of farm life hit me as I explained, you ate the calf? What did you think we did with the calf? She inquired. I went home for dinner. I'm sure there were other interactions, but they blend into a general history as I grew older and eventually moved away. Some 30 years later, our sitting and knitting practice resumed like clockwork from June through August for the next 14 years. After Agnes and her sister Lois were both widowed, they took up the nomadic life. Each sold their home, bought a 26-foot motor home, an economy car for errands and local jaunts, and joined two groups of retired senior single motorhome owners. They spent nearly 2 decades in caravan travels with newly found but like-minded friends. Thanks to their incredible mobility, I had the unparalleled opportunity to spend time with them as a grown-up, something not possible with the rest of my family. That's when my appreciation for these two self-proclaimed native Texans reached new heights. I asked Agnes and Lois how they were adapting to the single life. It was likely that one or the other of us would eventually be left alone, Agnes replied. So we needed to have our own interests. And they never ran out of interests. They lived in the warm Arizona desert in the winter months and the cool green of western Washington in the summers. The transitional seasons, spring and fall, they traveled from one site to the other, the long way. In their first mobile spring, they drove from Arizona to Baltimore, where Lois's eldest daughter lived, on their way to western Washington. Their aunt took them via the Texas Gulf Coast to Florida and up the Atlantic shore. Their trip back to Washington may have been a little more direct, but I can't guarantee that. Their Port Susan summers west of Marysville gave us the opportunity to spend many a Saturday in the shade knitting and telling stories, as long as they weren't off on a multi-day motorhome rendezvous somewhere in the state. On the road, throughout their 70s into their 80s, Agnes and her sisters shared adventures that took them from the Arizona desert to the Arctic Circle, across Canada to the Great Slave Lake, up the coast to Alaska, and down through Mexico to the Yucatan Peninsula. 3 of their trips required leaving the motorhome behind, their cruise on a freighter through the Panama Canal, 3 weeks touring England, Scotland, and Wales, and when Agnes was 86 years old and Lois a spry 79, a 6-week tent camping tour of Australia, followed by a 2-week bus tour of New Zealand. I sat with Agnes and Lois a few days before they flew to London, where they would arrive in time for the royal wedding of Charles and Diana. Excited about their pending trip, I waxed rhapsodic about the experiences that awaited them. You'll be in the midst of all the royal pageantry and ceremony, said I. We don't care about that, they replied. There are so many museums, landmarks, architecture. We don't care about those, they said. Music, art, theater, I offered wanly, running out of ideas as 3 sets of knitting needles kept on clicking. Finally, I asked, so, why are you going to England, Scotland, and Wales? We've never been there. After more than 14 years on the road with her sister, Agnes decided to settle down and moved into a beautiful 1-bedroom apartment in a senior facility in Phoenix, while Lois remained on the road. Our visits continued because I went to see Agnes as often as possible, usually about once or twice a year. On my first trip to her cozy apartment, I asked what led her to give up life on the road. I don't like stairs, she replied. Several years later, we were sitting and knitting one afternoon when Agnes, then in her late 90s, was putting the finishing touches on a tiny pink sweater. She announced, I'm done now. I've made a sweater and a blanket for every one of my family, including you. She said, it was green. This is my last one, number 105. They better stop having babies. I quit. Far from being coy about her age, Agnes always wanted credit for time served. The first time I asked, it was near her birthday, so I took her to Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor to celebrate. I'm 85 3/4, she announced with pride. Agnes departed for her final journey at the age of 98 2/3, but she will always be with me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, I was with you every minute. It was just delightful. One word jumped out.
Yes.
The word draw. Over the draw, you described something as a draw in Texas. What does that word mean?
Draw.
Draw. Do you,
Yeah.
is it a space? Is it a
Yeah.
a
It's
hill?
kind of a little,
A dip?
Yeah, sort of a dip.
Oh, I love words that have just something about them.
So you see them across the draw.
Yeah. Thank you, Marsha. That was wonderful.
Thank you very much, Nancy.
Oh, land. Aren't we lucky? Aren't we lucky? And here comes Nancy Weisner, and we welcome you, Nancy.
Thank you.
And look forward to hearing you read, but before you read, have you given thought to something about your process that we all might enjoy learning or might try ourselves is the other idea?
Well, this is two-part. When I was an adult, I got in the mail a little notebook from my mother in which she had typed up on lined paper recollections of her childhood, which I had not known that she was writing, and which just were wonderful. And that was shortly before she died, so that meant quite a lot to me. So then when my daughter turned, I think it was 20, I wrote a series of recollections for her about growing up in a small town in Ohio. Because not so much about me, but about the people, because I just wanted her to know what life was like before, all of the modern hoo-ha.
No.
So this is an adaptation of that.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's an event from my childhood.
Great. Oh, good.
This should be my mother's story. I wish I knew her better. I know she loved to laugh, that in our neighborhood softball games, she was a switch hitter, that she was a good piano player, that she could sing even if she was standing next to a soprano, that she would whistle tunes while she was at the kitchen sink, that she was our town's best first grade teacher. I know she didn't like any part of housework, This is why we had a maid, Juanita, who every day from 10 until 3 dusted and mopped and ironed and endlessly polished the furniture. But the thing that stood out most to me about my mother is that she purely hated to cook. Putting supper on the table every night was what she had taken on as her duty, I believe. It was her way of paying back for the privilege of getting to teach. In our tiny Ohio town, she was the only wife that we knew of who worked outside the house. And my dad, an upcoming executive with an insurance company in Columbus, always made it clear that she didn't have to. The calibration of domestic chores was complicated by something that impacted a good bit of my childhood. I was deficient in character. It was repeatedly said of me with a shake of the head and a little tisking sound, "She won't eat." No two ways about it. This singular fact covered most of my life. The emphasis on eating, what was put before me, I think was a combination of heredity and circumstance. I grew up during the Second World War. Both my parents were of German Lutheran stock. They were part of the greatest generation, people who stepped up, took charge, had victory gardens, mixed their own oleomargarine. I think that had I been allowed to get away with being a so-called picky eater, my parents would have thought that they had failed in their role of influencing my entire journey on the right and honorable path of life in a threatened democracy. My moral turpitude, so far as I can tell looking back, was based on refusing a helping of canned peas. In short, I had to mind. And minding meant, among other things, that I was to clean my plate. I was admonished to remember the poor children starving in China, though I could never figure out how they were going to get the food I didn't eat. At that point, in fact, my brother and I were digging a hole to China in the backyard. We were aware that adults thought this was amusing, and truth to tell, we really didn't think we'd get to China. We knew we would hit molten lava first. Most afternoons found us with pitchfork and shovel digging away. Then the hole got so deep my parents made us fill it in, afraid the sides would cave in. The probability of disastrous outcomes was also part of the lore of my childhood. I grew up on tales of children, a few of whom were distantly related by marriage or some other way to children I had never heard of and none of whom I know, who had played on the railroad tracks, or gone for a swim too soon after eating, or maybe had the sides of a deep hole fallen on them, and had been maimed or died tragic deaths. I loved those stories, especially since I never knew any of the subjects. I spent long periods of otherwise unoccupied time supplying all the background material, scenery, and staging for them. It shouldn't go unnoted here at that time that I was suffering from leprosy. At Sunday school, my interest in the birth and resurrection and stories of Jesus with the children was far outweighed by tales of the lepers. At one point, I became so certain that my fingers and toes were growing numb from the dreaded scourge that I confessed to my mother that she ought to be making preparations for my departure. This was after I had written little messages on the page-a-day calendar by the telephone, certain that when my family read them months later, they would be gripped anew by the sadness of their loss. After my solemn revelation, my mother responded by looking at me intently. "I'm sorry you didn't tell me this before," she said, taking me by the hand to the bathroom, where, by the purest good fortune, she just happened to have some leprosy-curing cream that she slathered on my hands and feet. As I said, I wish I knew her better. Pictures of me when I was little show a scrawny girl with a full, dimpled face and long, skinny legs, knees the size of softballs. It was obvious I didn't eat much. And the things I did eat didn't seem to make it to my alimentary canal, but stayed in my cheeks, to be stored up for winter or something. Lack of food was not bothering my overall well-being. I was never sick at all, even on the days I wanted to stay home from school. Back to eating. My mother could cook bacon, so parts of it were raw fat and parts were burned black. I never knew how she could do that. Even years later, when I myself cooked, I could never duplicate the bacon I had as a child. Scrambled eggs were always half-cooked, with whitish snot in them. Toast was brick hard and unbuttered until it came to the table, when you tried to press blobs of streaky oleomargarine into it. And that was just breakfast. I have to say lunches were a lot better, but that's because my mother set them out for Juanita to serve us. My brother and I were town kids, so we walked home from school for lunch, where every single day we had hot dogs, cottage cheese, and canned fruit cocktail for dessert, the kind with the pale pink maraschino cherries. My friends who were farm kids and whose mothers even made their own noodles loved to come home with me to a lunch of exotic hot dogs, in buns even. Supper was an entirely different nutritional story. My mother followed the time-honored principle of meat and three. Vegetables came out of cans, of course. Spinach was particularly detestable, with long, tenacious yellow-green strands that might have gotten caught in my teeth if I ever chewed it, which I don't remember doing. Canned carrots did offer the diversion of squeezing them out in the gaps of my front teeth. Beets were unspeakable. Amazingly enough, there were several things my mother could cook. I say amazing because you'd think that her skill at preparing a delicate pie crust with its carefully measured calculation of hand mixing and the varying amounts of water according to the day's humidity and its response to a judiciously floured rolling pin would have had some crossover in her cooking. But no, a meal that ended with an absolutely delectable cherry pie would begin with blackened pork chops, and I don't mean Cajun, a stringy mass of soggy spinach dressed with the ever-present vinegar, unadorned canned peas, and instant mashed potatoes, about which my mother would invariably declare, "They say on the radio that they're even more nutritious than the regular kind." To be fair, she did make great beef stew, and the days I could smell it cooking were happy ones. Of course, the meat and potatoes and carrots on the bottom of the cast iron stew pot were burnt, but I liked it that way. At some point along the way, I had the idea of pushing my uneaten food underneath the rim of my plate, so that when my mother cleared the table later after dinner, she lifted the clean plate to a perfect ring of food scraps on the embossed oilcloth. Nothing was said, but the next day I had one of her clear glass company plates to eat off of. Undeterred, I developed a way of skillfully putting culinary remainders in my paper napkin. Soon, again, with no parental comment, I alone had a cloth one. Our drinking glasses presented another opportunity. After a lot of practice, I learned to take a drink of milk while substituting the liquid for the puree of unmentionables in my mouth. All of this is obscured by aluminum drinking glasses in shades of lime, magenta, and turquoise. So, of course, I soon had a replacement from her good crystal. Finally, it got so that all my eating implements were wordlessly examined before I got up from the table. Then there would follow tiresome negotiations of one more bite and a little bit of this and a smidgen of that, each accompanied by retching sounds. My brother had taught me how to make these, and I was quite good at it, to the point that I would sometimes even be induced to perform them for him and his friends. It is quite amazing to me when I think back on it, that this little dance my mother and I were doing was done without accompaniment. She never harangued me or expressed exasperation, and she would let several days go by, just enough for me to get overconfident before she made the substitutions. She just wordlessly thought of ways to outwit me. I'm sure she was grateful that we hadn't gotten our dog at that point, because that would have added an entire new range of nuance. It may be a slight exaggeration, but after every meal that wasn't stew, I would have to sit at the table until my mother finished up clearing. And that took a long time, because she would often relax for a bit in the living room after dinner before returning to the chores in the kitchen. Maybe joining my father to listen to Jack Benny or Edgar Bergen or the Bickersons. When I think about that now, I am newly amazed that after having spent a long day teaching children to read and coming home to cook a supper, she alone cleaned up the dishes all by herself, while everybody else did other things. My father read his paper, my brother did homework or played with Lincoln logs on the floor of his bedroom, and of course I sat at the table. As I said before, I wish I'd known her better. Everything came to a culinary head the night my mother decided to cook a new dish, sweetbreads. It is one of those childhood traumas that I have successfully repressed. In fact, I revisited here for the first time in 60 years. To this day, I have no use for sweetbreads, even though I see them described in various tantalizing ways on restaurant menus. They may be delicious for all I know. I will die not knowing. These sweetbreads were in cream sauce, and my mother presented the recipe to us as a great delicacy. I knew I was going to have to eat the pale, slimy pile on my plate. I started to toy with it about a half an hour later, and after having my plate, napkin, and milk and glass frisked at least once. By this time, the sweetbreads were not only pale and slimy, they were cold. I took the first swallow. Immediately I began to gag. Not an artificial wrench like the ones made in nightly protest, but a real, genuine gag. I will never forget the bird's eye view I got of the table as I was swooped up by my father and rushed to the bathroom. Since there was nothing in my stomach to vomit, that really wasn't necessary. But the deep, painful retching continued. I was probably not unaware of the drama. My mother seated on the edge of the bathtub, my father pacing outside in the hall to the sounds of my distress. After that, my parents gave up. I don't remember having to sit at the table anymore after dinner, and I continued to grow like a weed in the shade, primarily nurtured by cottage cheese, hot dogs and buns, and pink maraschino cherries. And things did get better. We won the war, and General Mills invented Cheerios.
I think we'll all go home and write about our mother's cooking. That is the topic. Thank you so much. It was just a gift.
Thank you.
Full of laughter. Okay, and we'll tune in next week again and again to hear writers read. Thank you so much.